The day Richard moved into the old flat on Crowsford Lane, he noticed something unsettling about the neighboring unit. Unit 304. Unlike the others, which had curtains, plants, and signs of life, the window of 304 was empty, dark, a void staring back at him. Richard shrugged it off. New town, new start, he told himself. But on his first night, as he unpacked boxes in the dim glow of his living room lamp, he heard something from next door. A faint rhythmic tapping. At first, he thought it might be a tree branch brushing the window. But when he went to look outside, there were no trees near the building. The tapping was coming from inside the walls. Curious and a bit unnerved, Richard knocked on the wall. "Hello!" His voice echoed into the silent room. The tapping stopped, as if whoever or whatever was making the noise had heard him. He waited, heart racing, but no response came. Silence. The kind of thick, oppressive silence that feels almost unnatural. Days passed, and Richard found himself thinking more and more about Unit 304. He never saw anyone go in or out. The other tenants in the building were friendly enough, though when he asked about the neighbor, they grew quiet. "Don't worry about them," one old woman had said, her voice trembling just slightly. "Just stay out of their business." One night, the tapping started again. This time louder, more insistent, almost like someone knocking. Richard, half asleep and still foggy from a deep dream, sat up in bed and strained to listen. It was definitely knocking. Something was trying to get out. He bolted upright, rushing to the door between his flat and 304. Hesitating for a moment, his hand hovered over the door handle. Every instinct told him not to, that opening that door would bring something unspeakable into his life. But his curiosity gnawed at him like a festering wound. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. That silence again. He pressed his ear to the door, his breath shallow and quick. At first, nothing, but then, faintly, a whisper, a voice so low it felt like it was inside his head, not from the other side of the door. "Help me!" His blood ran cold. The voice was fragile, trembling with fear. He could sense the despair in every syllable. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't coming from a living person, but rather something trapped, something desperate to escape. Richard backed away from the door, his heart thudding in his chest, and locked every bolt. As he returned to bed, his thoughts raced. He knew he couldn't stay here much longer, not with whatever was lurking next door. The next day, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled into his bones. He tried to focus on work, on unpacking, but all he could think about was Unit 304. What was behind that door? Who? What asterisk was inside? That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across his flat, the noises returned. But this time it wasn't just tapping. It was scraping, a low, guttural dragging sound, like nails clawing against wood. Richard's skin prickled with dread. He grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. Every creak of the floorboard beneath him felt like a warning. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob. Before he could touch it, a single knock echoed from the other side. It was soft, deliberate. "Please help me," the voice whispered again, closer this time. Against every instinct, Richard whispered back, "Who are you?" For a moment, silence. Then the voice spoke again, clearer now. "I was like you. Once." He felt the weight of that statement, the words sinking into him like hooks. His breathing became shallow as he slowly turned the knob. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or some dark force drawing him in. But the door creaked open, revealing the corridor that connected to 304. The hallway was darker than he expected, the shadows swallowing the light from his flashlight. As he took a step forward, the air grew colder. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, chilling you from the inside out. The door to 304 was ajar. It hadn't been like that before. His breath caught in his throat. There was no turning back now. Richard approached the door to Unit 304, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if the very air was thick with menace. His heart pounded in his ears, the rhythmic thud almost louder than the faint, raspy whispers that seemed to curl around him like invisible fingers. The door to 304 hung slightly ajar, revealing only a sliver of darkness beyond. That darkness felt wrong, unnaturally thick, as if it was absorbing the dim light from the hallway. Richard hesitated, his pulse quickening as he extended a trembling hand toward the door. "Please!" The whisper came again, more urgent now, like a sob choked down by years of torment. "Don't leave me." The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn around, to lock his door and never come back. But something, whether curiosity or the chilling pull of that voice, drew him closer. He pushed the door open with a soft creak, and it swung inward with an eerie grace, revealing the interior of 304. The apartment was empty, not just devoid of people, but devoid of everything. No furniture, no lights, not even wallpaper. It was as though the room had been stripped of all signs of life, leaving only the hollow bones of the structure. And yet, the air was thick with an oppressive presence, like the lingering stench of something long dead. Richard swept his flashlight over the walls, the beam cutting through the shadows that clung stubbornly to every corner. As the light passed over the far wall, he froze. There, scratched deep into the plaster, were words. Chaotic, frantic scrawls that covered almost every inch of the wall's surface. "Unfer, get out. Help. Don't listen. Trapped. Underscore." The words overlapped, written in layers of jagged lines. Some were smeared, as if whoever had written them had done so with their own hands, or something worse. As Richard moved closer, his breath hitched. He could see the brownish-red streaks around the letters. Blood. The realization sent a cold jolt through his spine, and his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a violent bang, plunging him into total darkness. His flashlight flickered once, twice, and then sputtered out. The silence that followed was suffocating. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. He was trapped in the heart of the nightmare, and it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Then the whispers returned. Too late. The voice was everywhere, surrounding him, seeping from the walls, from the floor. "You can't leave now." Panic surged through him, and Richard stumbled backward, groping for the door. His fingers clawed at the wood, but it wouldn't budge. The door, which had opened so easily before, was now solid as stone, immovable. "Let me out," he screamed, pounding on the door with both fists. His voice echoed back at him, hollow and empty. There was no response from the other side. And then, from the far corner of the room, something stirred. The darkness shifted, coalescing into a shape. At first, it was hard to make out. A massive shadow, writhing and contorting, as if it was struggling to form itself into something recognizable. Slowly, it took shape of figure. A twisted, broken form that hunched over, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. As it moved, a sickening crack echoed through the air, like the snapping of bones. The figure lifted its head, and Richard's breath caught in his throat. Where its face should have been, there was nothing, just a void, a black hole that seemed to devour the very light around it. But the worst part wasn't the face, it was the sound. The figure was humming, a low, eerie tune that vibrated through the room, filling it with a suffocating dread. Richard's hands fumbled for anything, something to defend himself with, but there was nothing, just that empty, forsaken space and the abomination slowly creeping toward him. Its long, thin fingers twitched, scraping along the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. As it approached, the whispers grew louder, merging with the humming, filling Richard's head with a cacophony of voices. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have opened the door. Now you're one of us." The figure stopped mere inches from him, and Richard could feel the cold radiating from its body, an unnatural chill that seeped into his skin, freezing him in place. Its head tilted further, almost as if studying him, before a soft, gurgling voice escaped from the void where its mouth should have been. "Help me stay." The realization hit Richard like a sledgehammer. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't asking for his help. It was demanding it. It wanted him to take its place. Before he could react, the figure lunged. The figure lunged at Richard with a speed that defied its twisted, unnatural form. Cold, Skeletal hands latched onto his arms with a strength that made him scream out in agony. Its touch was ice, searing through his skin like frostbite, and he could feel the darkness from its body seeping into him, sinking deep into his bones. Richard thrashed, struggling to free himself, but the creature's grip only tightened. The whispers grew louder, deafening, like thousands of voices all screaming in his head. "Stay! Stay! Stay!" The chant echoed, growing more insistent, more violent. Richard's legs buckled beneath him, and the creature dragged him down, pinning him to the floor with its grotesque weight. His vision blurred, spots of darkness creeping into the edges of his sight. He could feel it, the darkness inside the creature, inside Unit 304. It was pulling him in, devouring him piece by piece. "No, no," he cried, clawing at the floorboards, trying desperately to resist the pull. But it was too late. The cold was spreading through him, numbing his limbs, freezing his thoughts. His heartbeat slowed, thudding weakly in his chest, as if the life was being sucked from him. The figure leaned in close, its faceless void inches from his face. A sound like a low, wet gurgle came from it, and in the darkness, Richard could feel the weight of its presence, a hunger older than the building itself. It wasn't just feeding on him, it was taking him. Every memory, every emotion, every piece of what made him Richard was being siphoned away. And then, just as he felt the last flicker of himself fading, the whispers shifted. "Give it to someone else." The words were soft, barely audible, but they pierced through the fog in Richard's mind like a shard of ice. The creature paused, its grip loosening ever so slightly. There was a choice, an option, a way out. But the cost was unthinkable. "Someone else," Richard whispered, barely able to form the words. The figure leaned back, releasing him just enough to let him move. His mind, foggy and weak, grasped at the idea. If he didn't give the darkness someone else, he would become the new occupant of Unit 304. Just like the thing in front of him, he would be trapped, forever feeding on the next poor soul who moved in. He could hear the creature's breathing now, wet and raspy, as though it were waiting for his decision. Its clawed hand hovered near his throat, ready to claim him if he hesitated. The weight of the choice crushed him. Could he do it? Could he condemn someone else to this fate just to save himself? But the cold was unbearable. The void gnawing at him was relentless, and his survival instinct, his desperate will to live, kicked in. Slowly, Richard nodded. The creature released him, its long, spindly fingers unhooking from his flesh. It stood over him for a moment, its faceless void staring down, and then, with a horrible, grinding sound, it melted back into the shadows, vanishing into the far corner of the room. The darkness swallowed it whole. The door to Unit 304 creaked open. Richard scrambled to his feet, panting, his body trembling. The cold was still in him, lingering like a sickness, but he could move. He could breathe again. He staggered back into the hallway, gasping for air as the oppressive silence of Unit 304 vanished behind him. His apartment door stood open, inviting him back into the warmth, the safety of his world. But he knew, deep down, there was no safety anymore. Not after what he had agreed to. Days passed in a blur. The sounds from Unit 304 stopped entirely. No more tapping, no more whispers. It was silent now, too silent. And Richard knew why. It was waiting for him to deliver the next victim. Every night, he lay awake, the weight of his decision gnawing at him. But as the coldness in his body grew, spreading through his veins like a poison, the need, the hunger, grew stronger. He had to do it. He had to find someone. One evening, as Richard stood in his doorway, staring down the dimly lit corridor of the apartment building, he saw a new tenant moving in. A young man, cheerful, oblivious to the darkness that lingered in the walls. He smiled at Richard as he passed, carrying a box labeled 304. Richard smiled back, but it wasn't his smile anymore. It was the smile of something hollow, something empty, something that had already been consumed by the darkness of Unit 304. And as the door closed behind the new tenant, Richard whispered to himself, "It's your turn now. The whispers resumed,